Welcome to VividBox HQ, where global crises collide. Ebola just hit Congo as US aid vanished, and the country controls 76% of the world's cobalt. May 17, 2026, the World Health Organization declared a global health emergency over a virus tearing through eastern Congo. 2 days later, the official count told the story plainly. 134 dead. 536 suspected cases, all of them in Ituri Province in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The strain is called Bundibugyo, one of the deadliest forms of Ebola known to medicine. This is not the DRC's first Ebola outbreak. The country fought this virus from 2018 to 2020, in an episode that killed more than 2,000 people. But the timing of this one matters far beyond Africa. To anyone who owns a phone or watches the price of an EV, the world has the tools to stop Ebola. Treatment centers, contact tracing, a vaccine that works. Yet the death count keeps climbing, and the global response is sounding the loudest alarm it has. The answer does not start in a forest in Ituri. It starts in a budget decision made in Washington, months before the first patient fell sick. By the end of this story, you will see how that one decision already shapes what comes next. A vaccine for Ebola exists, and yet it is not enough. Ituri Province is one of the hardest places on Earth to run a health response. It sits in the conflict-shattered northeast of the DRC, where armed groups have battled government forces for years. 4 agencies are now trying to coordinate. The DRC Health Ministry runs the treatment centers and triage units on the ground. The WHO leads international coordination. The Africa CDC has mobilized $2 million from its own reserves. And the US Centers for Disease Control has restricted entry for non-citizens who travel to the DRC, Uganda, or South Sudan within the last 21 days. That last detail tells you something important. The US CDC is not just worried about Ituri, it is already preparing for the virus to cross borders. The WHO has disbursed $39 million from its contingency fund. That figure is the entire international emergency allocation sitting in one line. To understand whether that money is enough, you have to look at what the DRC's health system was already running on and what it just lost. Because the cash on the table is not the cash this fight actually needs. In 2023, the DRC received $589 million in US health aid, second only to Nigeria on the entire continent. Then, in January 2025, the Trump administration suspended USAID funding for review. By May, that suspension looked permanent. Nearly $600 million a year, gone. Just before this outbreak began. Even with that American money, the DRC was spending only 2.25% of its GDP on health. Look at that orange wedge. It sits below education, below economic affairs, less than half of what general government services receive. A system this thin cannot absorb a $589 million hole, and that is exactly the hole that just opened. An outbreak in a forest in Ituri matters to anyone outside Congo for one reason: cobalt. The DRC produces 76% of the world's cobalt, the metal inside the lithium-ion battery of every electric car, every laptop, every phone. No other country comes close. Here is where it gets interesting. The cobalt does not come from Ituri. It comes from the southern copper belt, the provinces of Lualaba and Haut-Katanga, more than 1,000 kilometers from the outbreak zone. The industrial mines are physically far from this virus. So is global supply safe? Not quite. The real threat is not Ebola walking into a cobalt mine. It is the DRC's institutions, already stretched thin, getting hit again. When one ministry collapses, the rest follow. Mining policy, export rules, customs all run through the same fragile state. And that state just took a $589 million cut to one of its biggest budget lines. The mineral risk is not direct, it is structural. A weaker government cannot regulate, cannot tax, cannot stabilize the country the global battery industry depends on. Which raises a different question. If Washington is pulling back, who steps in? Chinese companies own roughly 80% of the DRC's copper and cobalt mines. So when American aid vanishes, does Beijing fill the gap? Probably not. Chinese assistance comes mostly as commercial loans for infrastructure, roads, dams, mines, not grants for health systems. The data we reviewed points to China pursuing mineral access, not hospital beds. The model on the right does not replace the model on the left. Back on the ground in Ituri, the problem is older than this outbreak. This is the same region that fought Ebola from 2018 to 2020, an outbreak that killed more than 2,000 people and pulled in a WHO Global Health Declaration in July 2019. Same province, same conflict, same broken trust. In communities where armed groups operate freely, response teams arriving in protective gear are not always seen as helpers. Burial practices clash with infection control. Quarantine instructions get refused. Contact tracing, the single most powerful tool in stopping Ebola, depends on people telling the truth about who they touched and where they went. In Ituri, that trust does not exist, and the borders are porous. Ituri sits against Uganda to the east and South Sudan to the north. The US CDC has already restricted entry from all three countries. That is the signal. International agencies are not just worried about Ituri, they are bracing for spread. The 2018 outbreak crossed into Uganda. It happened then. The same conditions are in place now. A health system bleeding from a $600 million wound, a population that does not trust the response, and borders that are lines on a map and nothing more. So if this virus does cross, what happens to everyone else? What happens to everyone else runs through trade. The DRC already shook the cobalt market once this year. On February 22, 2025, the country banned raw cobalt exports. By June, the ban was extended through end September. Cobalt prices that had been falling steadied at $33,558 per ton through the summer. The data we reviewed projects prices climbing sharply in the fourth quarter of 2025 as global supplies tighten and Chinese refineries, where most of the world's cobalt is processed, start eating into their own reserves. Now, layer an outbreak on top of that. Travel restrictions ripple through supplier networks. Inspectors cannot fly in. Mine workers from neighboring provinces stop moving. Customs officers from the same fragile state run thinner still. Even without a single case in a mining town, the ripple hits the supply chain. A prolonged outbreak could trigger export disruptions, price spikes, and shortages that move straight into the EV and battery industries. Carmakers in Detroit, Munich, and Shenzhen all depend on the same one country. The cobalt monopoly is the global economy's quiet single point of failure, and that point is now wobbling. What signals tell us how bad it gets from here? Three things will tell you how bad this gets, and the first one is money. Whether the WHO can scale beyond that $3.9 million opening allocation. If donors do not step up, the response simply stalls. The math does not work otherwise. Then there is the border question. The 2018 Ebola outbreak crossed from the DRC into Uganda. The US CDC has already restricted travel from the DRC, Uganda, and South Sudan. If new cases appear outside Ituri, this stops being about one province and becomes a regional crisis. The third pressure point sits in the south. How mining companies in the Copperbelt respond if outbreak risk lingers into late 2025. A few canceled flights, a few quarantine protocols for foreign workers, and the cobalt price spike the EV industry has been bracing for finally arrives. Here is the through line. A virus in a forest in eastern Congo connects to a budget signed in Washington, to mines owned by Beijing, to the battery in your pocket. When the world's poorest countries lose their biggest health donor at the moment a deadly virus moves, the cost does not stay local. It travels through supply chains, through commodity prices, through the trust that any international response depends on. The virus is what you see. The system underneath is the real story. If this situation shocks you, hit like, share it with someone who should know about the Cobalt connection. Subscribe for more untold crises before they hit the headlines. We post a new geopolitics story every day. See you tomorrow.